It's been 3 years since I built this cabin in the backcountry around Lake Superior, but to call it a work in progress would be a bit of an understatement. With just a couple weeks left in the season before there's 2 feet of snow in this country, I have a ton of projects that need to get knocked out to get this place dialed in the way I always wanted it to be. My name's Dave Whipple, and you're watching Bush Radical. Well, the rush is on. And by rush, I mean winter is coming. Every day from here on out is going to be cold, and snow could fall any time. Today may be the last day that's warm enough I can actually stain this cabin, which is something I've been putting off for a long time. One of the questions I've been asked ever since I built this cabin is, am I going to side it? And the answer is, I don't know. But for the time being, it does need something to preserve the plywood exterior of the cabin. And I figured I would just stain it with a good, solid, waterproof deck stain that not only will make the cabin look much more finished, but it'll protect all the wood until I make up my mind what I want to do. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is not my kind of work. I like chainsaws and sledgehammers and digging holes, and painting is kind of like just getting poked in the eye with a stick. But it's got to get done. This stain is for decks, so it's definitely going to waterproof a wall. Now, the brand I'm using here is Cabot. And I will say this, the other cabin on this property, I stained the entire thing with a Cabot stain called Fireside Cherry. That as soon as I bought it, they quit making it, and I had to look all over the state to find another gallon to finish up a back wall that is still yet unstained. I'll get to it sooner or later. But I will say this, if you pick a stain that you really like, make sure you're going to be able to get another gallon should you run short. Now, you wouldn't assume you'd go in and buy 2 gallons of stain in a hardware store, and then when you go back for another gallon, find out that you can't buy it anymore and nobody has it. But that's what happened to me. So plan ahead. Well, I think that's a huge improvement. I may or may not side this in the future. Next up, I need to build a shelf for the other cabin. You know, the one with the deck with the tree running through it? I have some scrap lumber left over from building the loft in that cabin. But that's not going to make the whole entire shelf. The actual shelves, I'm going to have to tear apart the bunk beds I made the last trip up here, because I'm going to modify those too. I'd like to get this place completely dialed in, so when I come up here in the snow, I won't have any work to do. I'll just have it set up the way I'd like it. Now, this shelf is going to be about 4 foot high, and it's going to have 4 shelves in it. It's all made from 2x10, and it's going to be as solid as can be. Right now, I'll get the sides of the shelves all cut and prepared. That way, when I tear apart the bunk beds and get the extra 2x10s out of the bunk beds that I need for the shelf, it'll be ready to go. Kind of a hopscotch way to build anything. I've got to start one project and then start another project to use the parts from the second project to finish the one from the first, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean. I tell you what, all this saw work sure builds up a thirst, and nothing quenches a thirst like a good old fruit barrel. Now, I loved these things as a kid, but honestly, they're really not that good. But you don't see them much, so every time I see them, I buy them.
Yeah, those are just as mediocre as they ever were, but you can get a whole case for $4. Not bad.
Now, my favorite part of doing shelves like this is the chisel work. Chipping out all the little pieces and then chiseling out the sections in the middle nice and smooth so that they'll take those shelves. It's just kind of therapeutic. Now, you'll notice I'm working right over top of my campfire pit. I like all my scrap to go straight down into the campfire pit. That saves me having to pick it up later and put it there. I keep one chisel at the cabin just for this type of work, because I know that I always forget some tool I planned on bringing. And a lot of tools can be substituted for something else. Like if you forget your hammer, you could use a brick or a rock. But if you forget your chisel, very few things fill in for a chisel.
Well, I guess I'll sit here and wait out the rain a bit.
Well, that's about as far on that shelf as I'm going to be able to get for the time being. So I'm going to move on to another project. I need to revamp my outdoor kitchen. I've never liked the setup, and it's time for a change. My biggest problem is the little round table that my Coleman stove sits on. I've never been happy with it. It always feels like it takes up more space than it provides. It's like an anomaly of physics. It occupies so much space on the porch, but it doesn't provide you a whole lot of work area. Not only that, but I'm constantly knocking things off the edge because it's round, and my old Coleman stove takes up the majority of it, so everything is set right close to the edge. And then I knock it on the ground. And if you want something to be stable, you can't go wrong starting with a 6x6. The basic idea here is I'm going to have a beam that supports a table that will be my outdoor kitchen, as opposed to a table with legs where the space directly underneath of it is occupied by table legs. This is just going to be a beam with a table on it. Very straightforward. So it'll be freestanding, and it should be about as stable as you could ever want. Now let's move this stupid thing out of the way. I speak harshly of this little round table, but it's been fine. It's done its job. I'm just so tired of things falling off of it. Makes me want to just store my butter and my salt and pepper and my coffee right on the deck itself, because that's where it ends up. Now the concept is simple. I set the two nails in the wall and in the post just so I have a helping hand to set this beam in place, and I won't have to hold it there and make sure that it's at the right height. Then I'm going to set it in and screw it to the post and screw it to the cabin. Honestly, this is my favorite style of construction. Just big awkward beams spiked in place. If I could build everything out of beams and logs, that's probably what I'd do. I like working with just big, heavy, solid timbers. Just a quick check to make sure it's level in both directions, and we'll call it good. Is it good? It's about good. Now for the tabletop, I'm going to tear apart my log bunk beds that I just made not that long ago, because I plan on renovating the bunk beds too. See, the idea is I'm going to take the plywood bottoms out of these bunk beds, and I'm going to use the plywood for my countertop for my outdoor kitchen. And what am I going to substitute for the bunk beds? I'm going to use these old cots, because the cots are so cushy. They got these springs, and you sag down. You got this nice little hollow area to lay in. So I'm going to incorporate the cots right into the bunk beds permanently. You'll see. And I'll use these two pieces of plywood that were part of the bunks for my tabletop. I'll just double them up so I got a good, thick, heavy tabletop. That'll work. Love it. I already feel liberated as a chef when I make my eggs and coffee in the morning. By this much space, it already feels like 150% improvement over this little round table. Get this stupid thing off my porch. Just like any home project, you do the project and then you live with it, and then you find the things you'd like to just dial in and tweak a little bit. And this outdoor kitchen has been very high on the list of things I've wanted to tweak for quite some time. That and getting a coat of stain on the walls at the very least. So having the kitchen wrapped up and having the cabin stained, I already feel like I've won. Time for a cup of tea. Now, I love cooking on a Coleman stove. I have several of them, and they're fantastic. But these little ultralight backpacking stoves are perfect for just heating coffee or heating water for tea, especially when you're not cooking anything else and you don't really want to fire up the Coleman stove, because they can be fussy, like this one. Sometimes they don't really want to burn right, and they take a little bit of time before they're happy. But that backpacking stove is instant. Just turn the nozzle and push the button and you got fire. Pretty late breakfast for me. I think it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But I think I've got as much done this morning as I wanted to, or could have ever hoped to. Now here's my plan. I'm going to cut off all the legs of these cots, and then I'm going to screw the cot frames directly into the framing of the bunk beds. That way they will be a permanent fixture. I can always keep my eye out for replacement cots because they are handy to have around, but they're so comfortable and I'm so used to them, I'm going to incorporate them right into the build. Luckily, it hasn't been too dry here, and I don't run a risk of starting a forest fire. Because sometimes this area is quite hot, quite dry in the summertime. Things get really crispy. I don't think I'd care to run an angle grinder that time of year. But now it's almost winter. Things are a bit damp, and I don't have any problem throwing sparks all over the forest. Now that the legs are cut off, the frame is not as rigid as it was, of course. So I'm going to drill a couple holes in here so I can screw this thing down hard to the framing. Then I'll never have to worry about it. Now the plywood bottoms that I initially had in these bunk beds, they really weren't that bad. But I've become so used to the sag of these cots and how comfortable they are. I just don't want to be without them. Now time to finish off that kitchen. I have some flooring left over from the other cabin. So what better way to cover a countertop than with some snap laminate flooring? I know that's pretty redneck, but I don't know what you expected. Now, a lot of the older laminate flooring, it seemed to be like a pressed board with kind of a, fake wood top to it. But this particular snap laminate, it pretty much feels like it's all plastic. I don't know that there's any wood to it at all. So I think it should hold up just fine over the weather, and it'll be something that can be wiped off, where this plywood's just going to soak up all the coffee and bacon grease and everything else I can spill on it. Now, last time I had to cut this laminate flooring, I just cut it with a saw, and it throws hard, sharp chunks of plastic everywhere. But then somebody in the comments told me I could just score it and snap it. And they were right. Much better. Very few improvements have made me feel so happy so fast as getting this kitchen dialed in. Well, when I put the cots into the bunk bed frames, I had to widen the frames a little bit. So I took the old 2x10 braces off the ends, and I had to make wider ones and install those. But that's all been part of the plan. The old braces, the ones right here, are what I'm going to use for the shelves in my shelving unit. But now that I've got the shelves cut, I can put the shelf unit together. Now already some of these joints are tight enough that they'd hold the shelf together without even putting a nail in it. You pretty much have to tap them into place to get them to bottom out. I made those cuts almost maybe a little too small, but it's working out. Just like one of my personal heroes, Red Green, would use, I'm going to use the fasteners that I already have in my pockets. A couple Torx head screws, some 8-penny nails, some 16-penny nails, some Galvies, whatever's in there. Looks like I'm out of screws. This will be my last one. So we'll switch to nails, and then tacks and brads and whatever happens to be in the pocket. Well, I think that shelf turned out just as good as I could have hoped. Well, let's take it over to the other cabin and put it in place. I've pre-measured the spot it's going to go, so now that it's done, I hope it fits. We'll find out. Man, it feels good to get done with a few projects and to move off the site. Seems like I've just been stuck here in the yard of the cabin ever since I got here. Nice to take a little trip to another place on the property that is half done, full of projects that I need to get to at some. Maybe just forget it. Now, of course, the plan is to finish this cabin too. But like all these cabin projects, they take a lot of time, and this is a really remote setting. So when I come here, I'm always limited on what I can bring, how much I can get done. So it's just a little at a time. We'll just chip away at it. Boy, that is absolutely perfect.
Perfect.
Now that turned out exactly how I hoped it would have. I really need to get to finishing this cabin. Some friends of mine and I are thinking of coming up here for deer season. Not that there's a lot of deer in the area. There's a lot more bear and wolf. And of course, porcupine.
Man, you can see the porcupines are doing a number on this place. They don't seem to be super big on plywood, but they love T111. I don't know if it's the glue in it or what it is, but what I think I'll do is wrap the bottom of this wall about 2 feet high in roof metal. That ought to do it. Between the abandoned cabin that I've got to renovate and this cabin and the other cabin, everything takes such a long time to get done. We'll chip away at it a little bit at a time. There's no rush.
Now, the projects I've still got on the books that I'd like to get knocked out on this trip, they're all going to require some rough cut lumber. So we'll need to take a good look at our bandsaw rig. Put some gas in it, make sure it's all working properly, and then throw a fresh blade on it, and it'll be ready to cut when we're ready to use it. It's been a few years since I moved this sawmill to this property, and I haven't used it since it's been set up here. So it's spent a whole lot of time doing nothing. We're going to see how it works out. That's kind of not surprising, because I know the carburetor could not possibly be gummed up, because I know there's no bad gas in it, because I've stole all the gas to put in the generator at different times. So it hasn't just been sitting around with old gas in it. It hasn't had none in it at all. Now, there's only so many really nice days in the fall, and this happens to be one of them, and I've spent most of it working on projects. So enough of that nonsense. The rest of the afternoon, I'm going to spend walking property lines, trying to establish exactly where the boundaries of this land are. It's not so much that I care where the edges of the property are, but I like to know what trees are mine. In case there's a dead tree I'd like to cut for firewood, or in case there's a wind-damaged tree that I'd like to cut for lumber, I'd never cut a log that didn't belong to me. So I want to make sure I know which ones do. There are so many big, beautiful, old trees on this property. Not to mention the waterfront. This little river crosses my property, and there's a lot of land here that borders the water. But there are places where the river snakes in and out of the property, and I'd like to know what part of the riverbank is actually mine. Now, to really get an accurate idea of where the property boundaries are, I find the southeast property corner marker. I've only found a few of these markers, but I know where this one is. From there, we're going to set the declination on the compass. I think it's 6 degrees in this particular area. And then we'll go from tree to tree that falls on our bearing and blaze a trail up the side of the property.
This white pine here is the next one in line.
It's pretty common to find a tree that is perfectly in line and then lose it by the time you get to it. So I've walked back and forth from the previous tree to the next one a couple times when it's a small tree that looks like every other tree, and it's really easy to just forget which one you were staring at.
This is a shame. There's a really nice red pine right here. There's a really nice one right here, and they're just beyond my line.
Now, after having spent yesterday evening walking the property lines, I've found several good dead spruce trees that had blown over in storms. Now, they're going to be really good for cutting siding, and we know that our sawmill is up and running and it's ready to go. So I'm going to clear out an area here and get started on this woodshed build. Check this out. I'm actually putting water in the hole. As soon as you get through the top layer of duff in this particular site, the sand is so dry that you can't pick it out with a post hole digger. It just falls right back out of the digger. So I've actually had to wet the sand down to get the sand out of the hole. It was just like beach sand on a hot day. Amazing.
Well, one thing's absolutely certain. This building is not going to be square. There's tree roots everywhere. Of course, this great big tree back here, I'm not going to harm any of the roots on that thing. That's my favorite part about this site, is this great big tree. So if I got to make a building out of square to miss the roots, I guess that's what we'll do.
Now, the idea for this shed is as simple as I could possibly make it. 4 posts, roughly square. I'm going to set a back header with a level, and then I'm going to set a front header with a level, and we're just going to build off of that design. Won't be much of anything to it, but by the time we're done, it'll be nice and sturdy. Now, this is a project I've had in mind for a long time. I like to be up here in the wintertime. It is difficult to get in, but it's very pleasant to be here. But you do need firewood, and I don't have anywhere to put it. Now, this property is almost 100% wooded, so there's wood everywhere to cut. And with a little tiny cabin like this, with a little tiny wood stove, well, it doesn't take much wood. But keeping your wood under a tarp gets old fast. It's quite windy sometimes here, and the wind blows the tarp around, and squirrels build giant nests underneath your tarp, and by the time you're here in the middle of January, there's 2 feet of snow and ice on top of your wood, and it's not that great. So a little shed like this is, well, it's been pretty high on the priority list. Now, as far as the roof, I'm just going to measure the overhang sticking out both sides and make it about even, and call it good. Then we'll lay out our spacing for our rafters. Now, this woodshed's a very odd size. It's 6 foot by 9 foot, so my rafter layout is going to be a bit odd. I just take that space and divide it by how many rafters I think it needs. Once the 2 end rafters are in and I've got my layout marked, I put on my double headers. I like this double header design. It's very simple, very straightforward. Gives you a place to put nailers so you're not toe-nailing everything into a plate. You're putting nailers up between those inner and outer headers. You know, another way to make this more simple than it even could be is I'm going to just put a board and tack it here at the very tip of these rafters, the one on the left and the one on the right. Then I'll just scooch these other ones up until they're perfect. I won't have to measure them. Just tack them in place. Once the noses are right up there to that first nailer board on the top and everything looks all skookum, I'll put in my nailer blocks. and it's a done deal. You know, I built a woodshed last year in Alaska, and then I built another one this year in Michigan, and this would be my third. I kind of feel like that's all I've been doing lately is building woodsheds. I guess I've been really behind on woodsheds. Now, the roof metal I'm using for this is black roof metal. And the reason for black, well, A, you can't see it from the view that you actually have of the woodshed. And B, when I called up the Amish sheet metal company up the road, they said, well, we can't get to you till tomorrow. I said, what are you running today? And they said, black. And I said, that works perfect if you can do it today. No problem. One of the best things about this roof only being 12 feet long, I don't have to lap any metal, I don't have to cut any metal, and in a couple of minutes I'm done with the roofing. Ironically, this building turned out to be a whole lot more square than I assumed it would be. Bonus.
Well, now I need to go get some wood to put on the sides of this thing to make it rigid, because it's just 4 posts and a roof. But I've got the sawmill here on the property. I don't have great equipment for logging, but we'll see what we can do.
Now, when it comes to what I have here for logging, of course, I have a chainsaw and we have the four-wheeler here. But this is what we're going to use for logs today. This is an old homemade log cart that I built probably 8 years ago. It's just a 2x6 and some wheels from a garden trailer. But it works okay. Just grab the necessities here and we'll be ready to go. Now hopefully we'll be able to get all the wood that we need out of this one down tree. It's right next to the trail, has very easy access, just has a billion branches on it. Now this is an old dead spruce tree. Blew down in a storm not that long ago. I think we're going to be able to get one good 6-foot log off this, and then maybe another good 6-footer. But I don't think we've got a good straight 9-footer. So we might have to look elsewhere for the 9s.
Well, this first 6-footer's got a little bit of rot in the end, but I can probably get a few good boards off it. This one's a little crooked, but it's solid. We'll see if we can get our 2 sidewalls off of those 2 logs.
Now, handling logs this size with this log cart are no problem whatsoever. The only thing that really is going to hold you back on what you can do with just a cheap homemade cart like this is how big of a log can you lift onto it. The thing with logging arches is you can pull over top of a log and lift it up using a winch. And that'll lift almost any size of a log. But with a cart where you set the log on top of the cart, you're kind of limited to what you can physically lift. I mean, there's always ways to get a big log onto a cart like this, a log that's too big for you to lift. Ramps and ropes and whatnot, but eventually it's just going to not be very practical. Now, I've shot 2 videos on this Harbor Freight sawmill, and what I have used it for, it's done very well, and it's about as simple as a sawmill can be and still be functional, which I really like. Some of the metal on it, especially the track, is a very odd size, so adding additional track to it becomes kind of a problem because it's not a standard chunk of angle iron like a 2x4 angle iron or a 2x3 angle iron. It's like a 2 5/16 by 3 and something. It's metric. You could always take the side rails off this track and just use regular angle iron and make a 20-foot long track. But if you wanted to add on to this existing track with more track, it would be hard to match the metal up. So as long as you're cutting short logs, 8-foot, 9-foot, this is a fantastic little mill. Anything longer than that, you're going to need more track, which means you're going to kind of have to reinvent the wheel. Now the idea here with siding this woodshed, as opposed to running boards horizontally and then nailing siding vertically, I'm just going to use horizontal boards. Live edge. I'm going to make them nice and thick so they're going to be plenty solid. Now I cut these boards about 7/4, about 1 3/4 thick. With that live edge, it's kind of got the right look for this area. A lot of old cabins in this Lake Superior area are sided with just big white pine slab siding. And it kind of has that vibe to it. Not that I really care, I just needed to keep my wood from getting wet. But there is something very appealing about rough sawn live edge slab siding. I gotta say I like it. Kinda looks a bit more like a livestock shelter right now. But there's not a hayfield for 40 miles any direction of here. I always like to cut the bare minimum of trees, so something always looks like it's been there. You know, you've heard me say that before. But I think I'm gonna have to clear out some more trees because I can't even get in there and nail back in the corner. Time for a cup of tea. Now tomorrow all I have to do is cut some firewood and finish up the back side of this shelter. So what I'm going to do is clean this site. It needs it so bad, and it always looks like a construction zone.
Whew. Well, the idea is tonight I'm going to burn up all this scrap, clean this site up, so tomorrow morning I could take these 2 logs that didn't work out for the bunks, I could saw them up, use them for the back wall in this woodshed, put a couple braces on the woodshed, and then I can cut firewood. But I've really been ready for a good campfire, and I've just been working till dark every day since I got up here. So tonight I'm gonna have a big fire. But first I'm gonna go bum around in the woods for a few hours.
Now not only do I need to burn up scrap wood from all the many projects, but I've got to get rid of those balsam trees I cut out to put this woodshed in. I don't generally cut a balsam tree for any reason. There's no firewood in them. Most of the time they're really difficult to burn unless you've got a hot fire, and they're all limbs. Thousands and thousands of limbs. So cutting one of these things down is really not the best idea. Now a while back I built that set of log bunk beds. And when I started that project, I cut this great big spruce tree and cut it in half with a chainsaw, which was a nightmare, but it was a big log and it was down a steep hill, so there really was no way to get it to the mill. So I did it all with just a chainsaw and a 2x4 for a guide. When I finally got it almost completely peeled, I found out it had a little bit of dry rot on one side. It was the very last thing I peeled off. So it obviously wasn't going to work for decorative bunk beds. But most of the log is pretty solid. So I'm going to saw it up into some 2-inch planks, and we're going to use this for the back side of our shed. Now this Harbor Freight sawmill is a mill that so many people have so many questions about, because A, there's a Harbor Freight in every town pretty much, and B, it's a cheap sawmill. I've found that it's extremely heavy duty for how small of a mill it is, and I've cut some pretty good sized pine logs on this, up over 2 feet around. You got to kind of tweak the mill a little, take it apart a little, move the handle, the push handle on it, to get that size of a log to fit. Because the handle's kind of in the way of cranking the head up as far as it can go. But for the money, about $3,000, it's a great little mill. Is it better than other mills that are in that price range? Well, I really don't know. But I would say this. If you can find one of these for $1,800 on Marketplace, you won't be disappointed. I mentioned earlier how much I like working over top of my fire pit. I still have a little bit of fire in there from yesterday, so it's kind of smoky and kind of hairy. Kind of got to watch where you put your toes. But I don't want to fill the yard full of chips and sawdust and whatnot. I like this nice blanket of pine needles. That's what I want up here. Now luckily, these logs were already about 9 feet. About 9'4" actually. So they gave me a little bit of extra room to trim off the ends, to get the ends exactly the length they need to be for the shed. And they were pretty much right from the get-go. This tree is just, it needs to get pruned because, man, it is right in my way. Well, these planks on the back aren't perfect, but at least I got to use up these logs. Man, after I cut them for the bunk beds and they were not perfect, it sure was heartbreaking. So much work for almost nothing. But it sure is nice to see that I found a place to put them other than just in the wood stove. Now we're going to throw on some corner bracing. This is really going to add to the rigidity of this building. Now this corner bracing doesn't need to be a 45, but by checking it with a speed square to make sure it's right there, at least they won't look different one from the next. When you're standing back and looking at the building, at least they're all on a 45-degree angle. But no matter what the angle is, it's going to add a massive amount of strength to that building. Finally, this is the thing that I really wanted, is some place to put stuff. Mostly firewood, but also some of these tarps that have been used around here. I can put some tools in here. I can put my scrap slab wood in here in case I want to make a bookshelf with it or a shelf in the cabin. Finally got a place to hang up my pole saw. Generally it just hangs on a branch on whatever tree it pruned last. Now I can finally put the sawhorses away for the year, get a rake out, clean this area up, hang my ladder back up, get this place situated to where it's past the construction for this year. Man, that's nice. Now time to sharpen up the saw and go out and get some firewood, because what's the point of having a brand new woodshed if it doesn't have any wood in it? I've been walking around this property now for over 3 years, looking at all of the standing dead timber that can be cut up and used as firewood. And I just walked past it, because there hasn't been a good place to put it until now. So it sure does feel good to go out and be able to take some of this wood and get it put up before it's not any good for anything. And to get a shed full of wood so I can come here anytime in the winter and not have to look for wood, it's just going to be wonderful. You know, one thing else about having a 6x9 woodshed that I hadn't thought about. Doesn't take very long to make it look like it's full. I appreciate that. You know, the idea of saving stuff up for later is pretty much the same every place you see it. Whether it's a barn full of hay or canning vegetables, saving money for retirement, whatever. Firewood's just the same thing. It sure is nice to gather it all up, put it in one spot where you know it'll be nice and safe and ready to use when you're ready to use it. Thank you guys so much for coming along with me on this trip to take care of all these projects that have needed to be done. If you're interested to see more about this cabin and how it was built, click the link up in the top corner, and there's an entire playlist on this cabin. My name's Dave Whipple, and you've been watching Bush Radical. Be radical, eh? See you soon.